near term. This is almost exactly, this is actually produces the same graph, only it's over squeezed into a shorter period of time, just to show you the type of curve that we're on now relative to the past. I also show this graph because it also displays something else, which is a lot of economists like to talk about, well, this isn't that big of an issue. Look what we did in World War II, which of course, as we all know from our statistics, is an observation of one. But let's take that observation of one and then look at what actually happened. If you look at the peak debt ratio in 1946, 45, 46, whatever it is there, what you'll see is how steeply we came back down. In fact, by the end of the Truman administration, debt to GDP was below 60%. And I mean, I've been involved in a number of commissions now saying, well, we can't get debt to GDP below 60% for at least 6 years or 8 years, and then we're not quite sure we're going to be able to hold it stable. So you can sort of ask what went on. Well, among other things that went on, if you think about it, in the World War II, and you think about this as being Keynesian policy, yes, it created a temporary and a huge deficit, but what were the policies in place? What was going to happen at the end of the war? Most of these expenditures were going to go away. And in point of fact, actually, it was just these expenditures, because when we went to World War II, as the expression went, Dr. Feelgood became Dr. Win the War. That was the criticism of Franklin Roosevelt. Actually, the domestic spending at the end of the Roosevelt administration, or the Roosevelt-Truman administration, was actually lower as a percent of GDP than it was at the start. It had already risen more under Herbert Hoover than it would be at the whole end of that period. Now, that's partly because the domestic spending was largely oriented towards employing people, right? And so once people were employed, most of that spending went away. So by the end of World War II, we moved rapidly to decline because basically spending is scheduled to drop dramatically. And also, if you want to take the other side of the budget, the tax increases that were enacted in World War II were there in a permanent fashion. Yes, they were reduced, but they weren't reduced back to pre-World War II levels. So you had in place a long-term budget that was clearly going to be in balance. And the only question, this is a crucial thing I'm trying to point out, the only question is whether each Congress and president every year was profligate. Because as long as they weren't profligate in future years, the budget in these old years would always move back into balance. That is, the current law never had built into it imbalance in the future. Now, why is that? Well, think about it. It doesn't matter if you've got a tariff or an income tax. Revenues generally rise with the economy, right? They're roughly proportional to income. They might be off a little bit, but they're rising with the economy. If spending is discretionary and doesn't have automatic growth built into it, then it's not rising. So even if you have a Congress that's very profligate, or you're trying to figure out how to get out of paying for the Louisiana Purchase or the Civil War or anything else, so discretionary spending rises way up, but the revenues are always on a long-term path to exceed that level of discretionary spending. So the only question, and the only real fiscal question, is in future years, are you going to keep raising that discretionary spending above the path you're already on? Now, you can do a lot of other changes as well. All I'm pointing out, the long-term budget, if you measure its imbalance, so if in 1942 we had a 10-year budget like we develop now and said, gee, what does it look like in 1952? You would have shown massive, massive, massive surpluses, right? That was the long-term budget in place. So what makes this fiscal, if you remember nothing else, what makes this fiscal crisis unique is no longer can you depend on economic growth and a slowdown in new enactments, new spending increases, or new tax cuts to get you out of the problem. Now we've built them into the law. And so you've got two issues. You've got not only the issue about keeping Congress somewhat cautionary on its new enactments to be able to get the fiscal house in order, they've got to rescind now, they've got to take back some of the promises they've made in the past. That was never, ever true in past fiscal crises. And as I say, you can look at just what happened after World War II. I mean, there's other things that went on after World War II. To be fair about it, interest rates were close to negative in real terms because of inflation, a lot of other things. But you still have in place this enormous scheduled drop in debt to GDP. So here's one example of what's happening because of the combination of the current recession, the drop in revenues under Bush, the constant increase in Social Security and healthcare and other spending. The red line is a projection of basically Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, which everyone now takes as sort of a summary of the entitlements. To be fair about it, those of you who do estimates, they're the only numbers we have 75-year numbers on, which is one reason we rely on it. But in any case, so it's Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, interest on the debt, I add in defense, and basically I assume which may not be right, that defense is going to decline by maybe a half percentage point of GDP from about 4.5 to 4 or something like that. So I don't know if it's right or not, but so that's in there. And you can see that that's all that's in the red line. And this other line is revenues if we would keep in place sort of current law, which means, current policy, which means that you would extend the Bush tax cuts and you wouldn't let the alternative minimum tax constantly have all this bracket creep that really pushes a lot of people onto that tax. If you understand it, basically we have this system that's putting a lot of upper middle income people onto another system. So if this is sort of current policy, what that means is current revenues at that policy are not even adequate to cover Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and in fact they weren't adequate already when we went into the recession, and they're not adequate in the future. So we're paying for the rest of the government out of the deficit, and we're not even paying for that part of government out of the deficit as we move into the future. So if you think about it not just in sort of liberal conservative terms, just think of how we're squeezing, the enormous squeeze we're putting on the rest of the budget by essentially by this growth in health and retirement costs and these low levels of revenues, whichever piece of that squeeze or those scissors you want to think about. So the last graph exaggerated a little probably where we're going to go in terms of revenues, because that said we're going to keep current policy in place. This is a graph that just shows you revenues under President Obama's proposals and revenues if you just keep current law. Now, those of you in the room remember I earlier talked about current policy, which is sort of assuming we continue not letting a lot of people go on the alternative minimum tax, and we let the Bush tax cuts expire. But of course, President Obama's already said he's going to not let most of the Bush tax cuts expire. He's actually going to extend them, right, except for those over 200, 250,000. And he's got some additional taxes, such as he did in health reform on interest and dividends. So here's where the revenues would be under current law. Under current law, which would have the Bush tax cuts expire, you actually have revenues higher than you would under President Obama's proposals. So actually you get a higher level of revenues. These are President Obama's proposals, which have a number of items, largely on higher income taxpayers. And so in the previous graph, I had revenues, current policies in place of about, about 17% of GDP. Under these policies, they would start rising up towards 19. As you can see in this graph, though, even 19 doesn't solve that growing red line, squeezing everything else. And these policies, by the way, do involve significant tax hikes for at least some people, and they require, in fact, it will be a major battle this year, because those of you who follow tax policy know that we didn't decide last year what we're going to do about such things as the estate tax. So the state lawyers are coming up to me all the time and telling me that they're debating what to do about people who are dying in 2010. But I keep telling them there's a solution. But, we live in a world, those of us who know Congress know that they can push the clock backwards, right? Remember those days when they decided something had to be enacted by 12 a.m. and so it started going to the next day, so they just pushed the clock back, and they made tomorrow today. So I've decided that what they're actually going to do is they're going to decide that any death in 2010 will be defined as retroactive to 2009. That'd be the Democratic side, but not to be outdone, the Republicans are going to decide that any death before 2010 will be prospective to 2010. So that's how we're going to deal with that issue.